Johnson first noticed the shouting when it sliced through the steady drone of the engines, sharp enough to make him pull out one earbud. At first, he thought it was a kid throwing a tantrum, but the voice was too forceful, too rehearsed, too dripping with indignant authority. He turned his head and saw the woman in the blue and white floral dress standing in the aisle, her bob haircut swinging as she jabbed a finger toward his row. Her sunglasses, shoved on top of her head like a crown, glinted beneath the cabin lights as she announced to everyone within earshot that she was in mortal danger. The tissue in her hand fluttered dramatically with every word she hurled at the bewildered flight attendant trying to calm her down. Johnson blinked, wondering how he had become part of whatever this spectacle was. He had been quietly minding his own business, trying to unwind after the exhausting delays that had stretched the day into something resembling a punishment. Yet here he was, being pointed at by a stranger who seemed determined to rewrite reality to suit her mood. She claimed he was the cause of her alleged allergy attack, though he had not even opened the snack bag zipped inside his backpack. Her performance was impressive in its intensity, though Johnson could not detect a single actual symptom on her face. She looked furious, not ill. Passengers turned their heads in waves, curiosity spreading down the cabin. Some lifted their phones reflexively before guiltily lowering them again. Others simply watched with open irritation. The aisle grew tighter as people leaned outward to get a better view. Johnson exhaled slowly and reminded himself that explosions of frustration in public transportation were nothing new, but this felt unusually targeted. He wondered if looking calm somehow offended her, or if she had picked him at random because he occupied the seat she wanted. The flight attendant closest to her was maintaining a commendable level of composure. He held a small clipboard tablet against his chest, his posture the very picture of professional neutrality. Yet the slight upward twitch of his eyebrow betrayed the skepticism he was trying to restrain. He asked her to clarify the nature of her condition, but she bulldozed past every question by repeating that she had been told she would receive a specific seat due to her life-threatening allergies. Johnson stared at her, searching for any detail that would make her claim remotely plausible. She did not seem frightened. She seemed offended that things were not unfolding in the manner she expected. Her disdainful glare flicked toward him again, as though she wanted him to stand up without argument. The implication was clear. She wanted his seat. She wanted compliance. She wanted the world to adjust to her declaration without requiring evidence. He finally spoke. His voice was calm, but touched with confusion he didn't bother hiding. He explained he had opened nothing, consumed nothing, and possessed nothing capable of triggering an airborne reaction. She cut him off before he could finish, snapping that allergies did not obey his understanding of them. She said being near him was dangerous. She acted as though sitting 2 rows behind him had put her life at risk. Johnson felt a tightening in his chest, not from guilt, but from a slow, simmering frustration. He despised being accused of harming someone when he had done nothing at all. The flight attendant attempted to regain control of the conversation by requesting that she lower her voice. She countered by raising it further. Her claim expanded in dramatic flourish. She insisted she had nearly collapsed earlier, but had been too strong to show it. Passengers exchanged glances that said they had significant doubts about that particular detail. She demanded immediate reassignment, preferably to a more isolated section of the plane. Her gaze flicked pointedly toward the curtain separating business class, as if its presence offended her by being out of reach. Johnson saw the attendant's fingers tapping lightly against the clipboard, the quiet rhythm of someone trying to maintain patience. He politely asked her to step aside so he could speak with Johnson directly. She refused to move, as though shifting an inch would validate an injustice. The attendant finally managed to guide her to the side, though she continued to mutter loudly enough for half the cabin to hear her accusations. When the noise settled slightly, the attendant leaned down to Johnson's level. He asked if Johnson had packed anything containing common allergens. Johnson listed what he was carrying, emphasizing everything was sealed. The attendant nodded thoughtfully. There was no immediate suspicion in his voice, but protocol required him to check. Johnson understood that part. What he did not understand was why the woman acted as though this was a personal battle she needed to win. As the attendant stepped away to verify her claims, Linda, as he overheard someone call her, returned to her seat and continued her loud monologue, making sure everyone heard that she might need medical assistance soon. Johnson watched her gesture with the antihistamine bottle, like a prop in a stage play. He wondered how many times she had done this before. Her certainty that the world revolved around her needs suggested practice. Johnson leaned back slowly and closed his eyes, trying to conserve what little patience he had left. He thought of the morning's missed connections, the hours of waiting, the stale airport air, and the desperate desire to simply arrive at his destination without incident. Yet fate seemed determined to test him further. He listened to her exaggerated coughs and cleared his throat to steady himself. He knew he had done nothing wrong. But being innocent did not always shield someone from the fallout of another person's theatrics. A man across the aisle leaned toward Johnson and whispered that he supported him, adding that the woman had been loudly complaining before boarding even started. Johnson gave a faint nod. He appreciated the solidarity, though it did little to lower the rising tension. The spotlight felt glued to him now, and Linda was feeding it with every word that spilled from her mouth. Minutes passed before the attendant returned, his expression controlled but tighter than before. He positioned himself carefully, as though preparing for another wave of chaos. He addressed Johnson in a low voice, letting the noise of the cabin fill the space around them. Johnson braced himself, sensing the shift in tone. The attendant inhaled slowly, then spoke with a polite firmness that told Johnson things were about to become more complicated. He explained that they might need additional information from Johnson due to the severity of Linda's claim. Johnson immediately recognized the implication. Her accusations, flimsy as they seemed, were now creating official obligations that he could not simply shrug off. He met the attendant's eyes, already planning how he would articulate the truth without adding fuel to her theatrics. But before he could respond, the attendant added a final sentence that carried the weight of looming escalation. "Mr. Johnson," he said quietly, "we may need to ask you a few questions as well." The words hung in the air, and Johnson felt the moment sharpen around him. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The flight attendant's quiet request for additional questions left Johnson suspended between irritation and a careful sense of strategy. He followed the attendant toward the galley, feeling dozens of eyes on his back. Each step carried the weight of someone being evaluated for something he did not do, and the absurdity of it all sharpened his focus. He wanted the truth exposed, but not through anger. Anger would only give Linda more fuel. He needed clarity, patience, and a clear path to reveal her intent without feeding her theatrics. In the galley, the attendant maintained a neutral composure, though the tension in his posture betrayed fatigue. He asked Johnson to confirm again what he carried in his belongings. Johnson described everything plainly, listing each item with deliberate calm. There was nothing unusual, nothing opened, nothing that could possibly justify her explosive outburst. The attendant listened attentively, nodding as he cross-referenced what Johnson said with the airline's allergy protocol. His tone suggested he already suspected Linda's story lacked substance, but official procedure demanded thoroughness. When the attendant finished, he thanked Johnson for cooperating. His professionalism never wavered, but his expression hardened subtly when he explained that Linda's claims required verification. Johnson agreed, insisting he wanted the truth clearly established. He returned to his seat with a measured stride, reminding himself not to reveal the frustration coiling beneath his calm exterior. Linda watched him approach. Her eyes narrowed as though she believed his compliance somehow validated her accusations. She clutched her tissue dramatically, making sure nearby passengers saw her discomfort. He ignored her pointed glare, unwilling to participate in her performance. As he settled into his seat, an older woman across the aisle leaned closer and whispered that Linda had been restless since boarding. She explained that Linda had loudly lamented her seating assignment and mentioned missing out on an upgrade. Johnson thanked her, appreciating the confirmation that Linda's behavior had a motive unrelated to allergies. Still, speculation was not enough. He needed something concrete that exposed the truth unmistakably. He watched Linda continue her exaggerated discomfort, her coughs sounding more theatrical than involuntary. The cabin's atmosphere thickened with unease. A few passengers, misled by Linda's dramatic claims, started murmuring that Johnson should simply switch seats. The suggestion floated through the row like an unreasonable breeze. Johnson remained still, unwilling to yield. He understood why they advised compliance. They wanted peace, even if peace meant rewarding dishonesty. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself the situation required strategy, not surrender. Linda escalated her theatrics just as the murmurs died down. She called a flight attendant over again and claimed she felt dizzy. Her voice trembled in a way that didn't match the steadiness of her posture. She said the proximity to Johnson's belongings was triggering severe symptoms. She grasped the antihistamine bottle, as though it were a lifeline. The attendant responded with polite concern, though skepticism lingered behind his eyes. He asked her to describe her symptoms with more specificity, but she waved him off and repeated that she needed a safer seat immediately. Johnson watched the exchange, recognizing her tactic. She wanted urgency. She wanted the cabin to believe she was suffering. Each exaggerated cough and dramatic sigh worked to build pressure against him. He knew she was manipulating the situation, but her determination to bend reality to her narrative impressed him in a troubling way. She seemed committed to her role, regardless of how transparent her intentions were becoming. The attendant attempted to reassure her, suggesting they wait for the supervisor to complete the verification. Linda interrupted, insisting delays were risking her health. Her voice rose again, climbing in pitch and volume. Passengers flinched at the sound. Johnson understood the emotional power of volume. Loudness often overshadowed logic. She wielded it expertly. When the supervisor arrived, the tension in the aisle tightened. He approached with a tablet in hand, his demeanor firm, his patience noticeably thinner than before. He addressed Linda politely but directly, asking her to clarify her earlier statements. She repeated that she had arranged accommodations in advance and had been promised a specific seat. The supervisor listened, expression unreadable. Johnson leaned back, watching carefully, waiting for the gap between her story and the truth to widen. The supervisor explained that the airline maintained strict records regarding medical accommodations and that they were currently reviewing her file. The announcement visibly startled her. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face before she disguised it behind indignation. She accused the airline of losing her documentation. She insisted she had spoken to multiple agents. She claimed incompetence on the part of the staff. Her narrative expanded rapidly, piling excuses atop accusations in a desperate attempt to maintain authority. The supervisor maintained his composure. He informed her that the verification process required only a few minutes. Linda responded by demanding he expedite it. She paced in the narrow aisle, gesturing dramatically, as though she were the center of an unfolding emergency. Her restless movements stirred whispers among passengers. Some seemed annoyed by her persistence, while others still believed her claims. The division fed the tension further, creating invisible fault lines throughout the cabin. Johnson understood that Linda's story depended on urgency. The longer the crew took, the more unstable her claims would appear. He recognized an opportunity to shift the direction of the conversation. He asked the supervisor, in a calm and steady voice, whether they could review the call logs related to her alleged accommodation request. He explained he wanted to ensure he had not inadvertently taken a medically designated seat. His tone framed the suggestion as reasonable, even considerate. The supervisor nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the practicality of the idea. Linda's reaction was immediate. She interrupted sharply, insisting the logs would not prove anything. She claimed the airline had assured her verbally, leaving no digital trace. Her argument grew increasingly tangled as she attempted to dismiss the credibility of concrete records. The supervisor listened without interrupting, his expression cooling with each inconsistency. Johnson observed the unraveling quietly, resisting the urge to smirk. Her desperation was telling. Every contradiction pulled another thread from the fabric of her performance. She spoke louder, but volume no longer wielded the same power. Doubt had begun to settle across the cabin like a draft, subtle but unmistakable. The supervisor excused himself to verify the information. Linda watched him go with a tight jaw, then turned her glare back toward Johnson. She accused him of manipulating the crew against her. She claimed he was twisting the situation to make her look unreasonable. He responded evenly, explaining he only wanted clarity. She scoffed, calling it an obvious lie. Minutes later, the supervisor returned. His expression, once neutral, now carried the certainty of someone who had drawn a decisive conclusion. He held the tablet with both hands, ready to deliver information that would undoubtedly shift the balance of the conflict. He approached Linda first, his voice steady and controlled as he prepared to speak. Passengers leaned toward the aisle, sensing the turning point. Even the hum of the engines felt quieter, as though the plane itself waited for the verdict. The supervisor drew a breath, meeting Linda's eyes with measured calm. "Ma'am," he said, "we've reviewed the records." The moment froze, suspended between accusation and consequence, and Johnson knew the truth was finally beginning to surface. The supervisor's announcement landed with a quiet force, drawing every nearby passenger into a suspended breath. Linda straightened, gripping the armrest as though bracing for turbulence. Johnson remained still, watching with measured patience, his heartbeat steady despite the rising anticipation. The supervisor continued, explaining that no medical documentation existed in her profile, no previous calls had been logged, and no seat accommodations had been requested at any point. The words cut cleanly through the performative fog Linda had created. Her expression faltered, the confident veneer slipping as she tried to recalibrate her next move. She opened her mouth, but her voice wavered. She insisted the airline must have lost her paperwork. She claimed the system was unreliable. She argued that she had spoken to someone who assured her everything was already arranged. Her desperation grew sharper with each excuse. She struggled to maintain the authority she had projected so fiercely only minutes before. Passengers watched, some with frustration, others with a hint of grim satisfaction. Johnson simply observed, knowing the truth had finally begun to corner her. The supervisor listened politely before stating that they had checked all internal systems. Nothing supported her claims. Linda's posture stiffened. She tried again to shift the blame, insisting that she should not be punished for an administrative error. But her tone betrayed the reality she could no longer mask. The supervisor calmly reminded her that fabricating medical emergencies during a flight was a serious violation of policy. A ripple of discomfort moved through the aisle. Linda's eyes darted from the supervisor to the passengers around her, searching for sympathy, but finding largely unimpressed faces. She pointed at Johnson abruptly, accusing him of lying and conspiring against her. Her voice rose, but the emotional weight behind it had thinned. She said he had endangered her health with careless disregard. Johnson met her glare with quiet steadiness, denying nothing except the falsehoods themselves. He reminded her that he had offered solutions, attempted cooperation, and complied with every request made by the crew. The contrast between their behavior was now unmistakable, and she knew it. The supervisor intervened before she could continue. He informed her that due to her disruptive behavior and the false claims she had made, she would be reassigned, not to an upgraded seat, but to one in the rear of the plane where she could sit without further disturbing others. The announcement echoed across the nearby rows. Her face drained of color as she absorbed the humiliation embedded in the decision. She protested loudly, swinging between outrage and incredulity. She insisted she would not move, that she deserved respectful treatment, that the crew was overreacting. The supervisor remained firm. He explained that her behavior had compromised the cabin's order and that the reassignment was final. A second attendant arrived to escort her, and the aisle became a narrow stage upon which her pride unraveled. She stood slowly, gripping her tissue as though it could shield her from the consequences. Passengers watched as she gathered her belongings, muttering under her breath. She cast one final accusatory glance at Johnson before following the attendant down the aisle toward the back of the plane, her step stiff and begrudging. As she disappeared behind the last row, the tension that had stretched through the cabin loosened like a cord finally unknotted. The hum of conversation returned, quieter and relieved. Johnson leaned back, allowing himself a fuller breath than he had taken since the confrontation began. The supervisor approached him with a tone softened by gratitude. He apologized for the inconvenience and thanked Johnson for his patience and composure. Johnson nodded, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation without dwelling on it. A passenger across the aisle raised his hand in a subtle gesture of solidarity. Another nearby traveler leaned forward to whisper that she admired how calmly he handled everything. Johnson offered a small smile, though exhaustion tugged behind it. He had not sought attention or praise. He had simply refused to be bullied. Still, their words eased the lingering weight of the ordeal. The flight resumed its steady rhythm. Announcements crackled overhead. The attendants resumed their duties with renewed efficiency. Johnson allowed the normalcy to settle around him, grateful for the reprieve. Yet a faint awareness lingered that Linda was still somewhere on the plane, simmering in her frustration, probably rehearsing the complaint she would file once they landed. He pushed the thought aside, content with the knowledge that truth had prevailed for now. About an hour later, as the cabin lights dimmed for the remainder of the journey, one of the attendants quietly approached Johnson again. They leaned close enough that only he could hear and explained that Linda's actions had triggered an internal report. False medical claims, aggressive behavior, and attempts to manipulate seat assignments were automatically documented. It was possible the airline would review her passenger history and decide on further consequences. The attendant thanked him once more for his patience and encouraged him to reach out after landing if he experienced any issues related to the incident. Johnson nodded appreciatively. He felt no desire for revenge, but there was a certain balance in knowing her actions would not fade into anonymity. Actions had consequences, even at 30,000 feet. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic vibration of the plane settle into a quieter background hum. The earlier chaos seemed distant now, almost dreamlike, though he could still recall every detail of Linda's escalating theatrics. When the plane began its descent hours later, the cabin lights brightened and passengers stirred. The sense of finality brought a calm anticipation. Johnson gathered his things, preparing for the landing. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled along the tarmac, he felt the tension he had been carrying begin to loosen entirely. When passengers began to stand, the attendant passed by him once more. They paused briefly and murmured that Linda had remained mostly quiet in the back, though clearly displeased. Then, in a lower voice, they added that she had been flagged for review. Johnson absorbed the information with a thoughtful nod. The attendant moved on, leaving the implications hanging in the air like a final note. Johnson stepped into the aisle, waiting his turn to disembark. The passengers around him gave small acknowledgments, nods, polite smiles, subtle gestures of support that required no words. He appreciated the quiet solidarity. As he stepped through the exit door and felt the change in air, he recognized the rare, gratifying feeling of a situation resolved not through conflict, but through patience, persistence, and truth. He walked into the terminal with a steady stride, aware that the story had reached its conclusion, though its echoes would likely follow Linda further than she anticipated. And as he moved forward, leaving the cabin's turbulence behind, he couldn't help wondering what she might say in her complaint, and how the airline would respond once they reviewed every detail she had tried so desperately to twist.